The desert sky bled out, all copper and deep violet, the kind of pretty that makes a man quiet. Down below, in a town that had more dust than people, a woman stood by a fire. She was stirring a pot of beans, the smoke curling around her face like a ghost. Her name was Alara, and she was a widow, an Apache widow. That alone made her an outsider. The folks in town, they had her pegged. She was 28, they'd say, but grief had carved lines into her face like the sun bakes cracks in the mud. To them, she was just a plain woman in a patched-up shawl, her shoulders stooped from work. They saw what they wanted to see. They didn't look long enough to notice the spark deep in her eyes, a little coal that refused to go cold. It had been 3 years since a border skirmish took her husband, Liam, or at least that was the story everyone knew. Alara never talked about it. She didn't talk much at all. What she did was cook. She'd feed old Samuel, the ranch hand whose bones ached too much to cook for himself. She'd take broth to the little Miller boy when his mother was down with a fever. She'd even leave a bowl out for the town drunk, who'd eat it and never say a word of thanks. The town whispered, "She ain't much good for anything else," they'd mutter over their beers at the saloon. Alara heard the whispers. She let them talk. Words were just wind, and they couldn't hurt her. Not like the silence in her little adobe house could. Not like the cold spot in her bed where a man used to be. The whispers were nothing compared to the nights. One day, right at the edge of winter when the air was getting teeth, a cowboy rode into town. He was the kind of man who wore his swagger like a second pistol, all flash and noise. His paint horse was covered in the white dust of a long trail, and he stopped right at her door. He tipped his hat with a grin that said he'd seen 1,000 women just like her in 1,000 dusty towns. She didn't invite him in, but he came in anyway. She did what she always did. She set a piece of bread on the table, poured him a cup of black coffee, and ladled a heavy scoop of beans into a bowl. He ate like a wolf, a careless, thoughtless hunger. He ate like a man who believed kindness was free, something you could take without ever paying a price. When he was done, he pushed the bowl away, leaned back in his chair, and looked at her. He wasn't looking at a person. He was looking at a puzzle he thought he'd already solved. "You're kind," he said, and his voice was thick with something that wasn't kindness at all. It was mockery. But kindness don't make a woman much good. His eyes crawled over her patched shawl, her hands, worn and chapped from work, the hollows of her cheeks. "You got a fire, I'll give you that," he sneered, nodding at her hearth. "But no man stays long for just beans and silence." Inside her, a storm was raging, a hot, furious tremor that wanted to scream. But on the outside, Alara was as still as a stone in the desert. She simply picked up his empty plate, her face as calm as a windless day. She washed it, dried it, and set it back on the shelf. She didn't say a single word. The cowboy let out a short, ugly chuckle. He tossed a few coins on the table, the metal ringing loud in the quiet room. Then he stood up and walked out, disappearing back into the night that had spat him out. Alara watched him go. There was no tear in her eye, no curse on her lips. She just watched until his shadow was gone. As she turned back to the fire, a single, tiny piece of ash fell from the grate and vanished into the dirt floor. It was almost like a sign, something falling apart. By the next morning, the cowboy's words had spread through the town like a fever. They were on everyone's lips. "Kindness don't make a woman much good," the men would smirk at the saloon. "No man stays long for beans and silence," the women would whisper over their fences, shaking their heads with a kind of pity that was sharper than any insult. Even the preacher, a man too tired for God's mercy, just shrugged when he heard. Alara walked through their stairs like a ghost. She had to buy flour at the general store, and the air grew thick and quiet when she entered. They all watched her, their eyes filled with his judgment. If they wanted to think she was unworthy, she wasn't going to argue. She had learned a long, long time ago that her silence was a better shield than any argument she could make. But when she got back to her little house, the silence was different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was loud. The walls seemed to echo with the cowboy's laughter, with the town's whispers. Not much good. Not much good. She pressed her hand flat against the cool adobe wall, the rough texture grounding her for a second. "If I cannot be loved," she whispered to the empty room, her voice raspy from disuse, "I will not stop giving." It was a promise to herself, a defiance. So she gave more. She pushed back against the loneliness by sheer force of will. She brewed a strong, clear broth for the feverish Miller boy, and sat with him until his shivering stopped. She kneaded dough until her arms ached, leaving fresh, warm loaves on doorsteps before the sun was even up. She carried a pot of thick vegetable soup to the widow across the arroyo, a woman who never said much, but whose eyes would fill with tears at the smell of a home-cooked meal. Every act of kindness was a stitch, pulling the frayed edges of her soul back together. Every bowl of soup she handed over was a silent scream that said, "I am still here. I am still human. You will not make me disappear." It was a battle she fought every day, with a ladle and a cast-iron pot. But the loneliness was a patient enemy. It was a slow poison, seeping into her bones. At night, when the desert wind howled and rattled the shutters of her small home, the fight would go out of her. She'd sit by the fire, her only companion, and trace the rim of an old tin cup with her finger, and his words would come back, circling in her mind like vultures. Not much good. Not much good. She'd shake her head, as if to physically throw the words away, and go back to stirring whatever was in the pot. The motion was steady, practiced, but her hands, they were not. One evening, as the sun set and painted the mountains in shades of orange and purple, she did something different. She carried her big black pot outside and set it on a fire she built under the vast open sky. The stars began to pop out, one by one, like tiny holes punched in a black velvet blanket. The air grew sharp and cold, carrying the lonely cries of coyotes from the hills. She looked out at the dark horizon, the same direction her husband Liam had ridden 3 years ago, never to return. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she spoke to him, her voice a low, rough thing. "Perhaps love will not find me again," she said to the emptiness. "Perhaps my fire will burn alone." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "Still," she said, her voice growing stronger, "I will keep it lit, for someone may need its warmth, even if they do not stay." Just as the words left her lips, the wind picked up. It wasn't a normal wind. It was a long, hollow sound, like a deep sigh, and it seemed to lift her words right off her tongue and carry them up into the night sky, pulling them away to some place she couldn't see. She closed her eyes, feeling the heat of the flames on her face, and pulled her shawl tighter. In that single moment, she felt everything at once, abandoned and infinite, forgotten and fiercely, stubbornly alive. The fire popped loudly, and a single bright orange spark leaped from the flames. It flew up into the darkness, a tiny shooting star, and then it was gone. It felt like an answer. She opened her eyes and whispered to the darkness, a desperate, hopeless prayer. If only the night could whisper back. And that's when things got strange, because it was the very next day, as the sun was bending low and spilling gold across the dusty street, that he appeared. Another cowboy. But this one was different. He rode a dun-colored horse, solid and steady. He was broad-shouldered, but he sat in his saddle with a quietness that the other man could never have understood. His eyes were hidden in the shadow of a hat brim that looked like it had seen more than its fair share of storms. He rode without making a show of it. No swagger, no noise. He just moved through the town like a part of the landscape. He tied his horse at the public well and bent down to draw water. Alara was already there, filling a heavy clay jug, her shawl pulled tight around her. For just a second, their eyes met. Hers were cautious, wary. His were patient. In that 1 second of stillness, the air itself seemed to change. He gave her a slow, small nod. Then, without a word, he took the rough rope from her hands and drew the heavy, water-filled bucket up for her. He didn't speak more than was needed, but his silence wasn't like the town's silence. It wasn't a judgment. It wasn't empty. It felt full, like it held weight. When he handed her the now full jug, his calloused fingers brushed against hers, and his hand lingered just for a moment, just long enough to make sure her grip was steady. Then he turned and walked away, his boots leaving soft prints in the dust. She watched him go, and the only thing she thought was that his silence didn't have any cruelty in it. It was a clean silence, and in that town, that was a rarer thing than gold. She dismissed it, thinking he was just another rider passing through. She was wrong. The next evening, just after the sun had dipped below the horizon, she looked up from her pot, and he was there, sitting at her small wooden table. He had taken his hat off and held it in his lap. He still had the smell of the trail on him, dust and leather and horse. She tensed, her mind flashing back to the other cowboy, the cruel one. She was expecting the same sneer, the same mockery. She ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of him. She didn't say a word. She waited for the insult. But it never came. He ate slowly, deliberately. Each spoonful seemed measured, as if he was tasting every ingredient. It was the way a man eats when he respects the food, and more than that, respects the hands that made it. When the bowl was empty, he didn't lean back and laugh. He didn't toss a coin on her table. He just looked at her, his eyes clear and direct, and he said 2 words. 2 words she hadn't heard in a very, very long time. "Thank you." He said it softly, almost like a prayer. And those 2 simple words hit her harder than all the cruelty, all the insults, all the whispers combined. She was so stunned, she could only nod. She didn't know what to do with gratitude. It was a foreign language she'd forgotten how to speak. She turned to wash his bowl in the basin, and when she turned back around, he was gone. Vanished back into the night as quietly as he had arrived. The days that followed were marked by these small, silent gestures. One morning, she woke up to find the section of her fence that had been sagging was now mended, the rails fitted together with a skill she didn't possess. Another evening, a neat stack of freshly chopped firewood appeared by her door, enough to last her a week. There was never a note. He never left a name. But she knew. She knew it was him. He never asked to come inside. He never demanded anything more than the simple meal she offered when he appeared at her table after sunset. But his presence began to hum at the edges of her life, like a half-remembered song. He didn't look at her like she was broken. He didn't look at her like she was a burden. He looked at her like she was steady, something worth tending to, something solid in a world of dust and wind. And of course, the town noticed. They always noticed. Old Samuel, the ranch hand, was in the saloon one night when the quiet cowboy rode past. He spat a stream of tobacco juice and muttered to the bartender, "That boy ain't just there for the supper." The preacher, seeing the cowboy head towards Alara's house for the 5th night in a row, raised a suspicious eyebrow. The whispers started up again, a new current of gossip and speculation swirling through the town's dusty streets. But this time, it was different. This time, Alara didn't shrink from their stares. She walked through town with her head held level, her gaze steady. Her heart was beating a strange, fast rhythm she thought had been buried 3 years ago with her husband, but she didn't let it show. She was still silent. But her silence was no longer about hiding. It was about waiting. Then one night, The desert sky ripped open. A furious storm broke over the town, the kind that feels like the end of the world. Thunder cracked like a whip, and rain came down in sheets, turning the dust to mud. The wind clawed at her little house, rattling the windows in their frames. And in the middle of it all, he arrived. He was soaked through, his shoulders gleaming with rainwater, his hat pressed against his chest as a sign of respect. She opened the door and let him in without a word. She pointed him towards the fire, and he sat, the storm raging around them like a caged beast. He didn't ask for food this time. He just sat and watched her as she tended to the pot, simmering on the hearth. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the howling wind. Finally, she couldn't stand the silence anymore. She had to speak the truth that had been branded on her. She kept her eyes fixed on the stew, unable to look at him. "I ain't much good for you," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "But I can cook." It was a confession. It was her deepest wound, the cruelest thing ever said to her, and she was laying it at his feet. She was offering him the broken version of herself that everyone in town saw. She expected him to stand up. She expected him to nod, tip his hat, and walk back out into the storm, leaving her with nothing but the echo of her own brokenness. But he didn't move. He leaned forward into the firelight, and his voice was softer than the rain, but stronger than the thunder. It was steadier than the fire that burned between them. "You'll never be lonely again." It wasn't a flowery promise. It wasn't a charming lie. It was a statement, as simple and solid as the earth, as heavy as a stone. She finally lifted her eyes and met his gaze, and in that moment, the storm outside, the town, the whispers, all of it just faded away. His eyes held her, but not like a possession, not out of pity. He looked at her like an equal. He looked at her as if he had been searching for her, specifically, across countless miles of trail and through years of his own silence. Something inside her chest, something that had been frozen solid for 3 years, began to crack. It was terrifying and tender all at once. Loneliness had been her armor, her quiet, constant companion, and now it felt as fragile as glass, about to shatter into a million pieces. Her hands were steady now. Her soul was shaking, but her hands were steady. She placed the bowl of stew before him. He ate with the same quiet reverence as always, but now every bite felt like a sacrament. Every moment of shared silence was a vow. She watched him, the way the firelight softened the hard lines of his face, the way the storm outside seemed to grow quiet right at the edges of his presence. The cracks in her loneliness widened, not with pain, but with release. When he finished the meal, he didn't get up to leave. He did something small, but it was louder than the thunder. He took his hat, the one that had seen so many storms, and he set it gently on her table. The soft thud of the felt hitting the wood echoed in the small room. It rang louder than the rain, louder than the town's gossip, louder than every cruel word she had ever endured. It was a statement, plain and fierce. He wasn't just passing through, he was staying. Her breath hitched in her throat. Slowly, she reached across the table, and her fingertips brushed against the back of his hand. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The storm still raged outside, but inside her little house, the silence was no longer empty. It was full. It was brimming with everything they hadn't said, everything that was just beginning. As the fire burned low, a powerful realization washed over her. The little spark she had so carefully kept alive for strangers, for the needy, for herself, it had finally found its match. The flame wasn't just hers anymore. It was theirs. And for the first time in 3 long, empty years, the night ahead didn't feel like an endless, dark ocean. It felt like a beginning. But a beginning of what? She thought it was the start of a quiet life, a life where silence was a comfort, not a weapon. She was a fool to think it would be that simple. The desert never gives you anything without demanding a price. She was about to find out just how high that price was. The man, His name was Silas. He started talking, little by little, in the days that followed. Not about himself, but about her. He'd ask about the herbs she grew, about the way she baked her bread. He noticed things. He noticed the way she always looked to the southern horizon at dusk, the direction Liam had gone. He never pushed. He just watched. The town, however, wasn't so patient. The preacher, Reverend Miller, stopped by one afternoon. He was a tall, thin man with eyes that were always judging. "Ilara," he said, not bothering to come inside. "The town is concerned. This man, this Silas, no one knows him. It's not proper for him to be taking his meals here, to be mending your fence." "He has been kind," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. "Kindness is a mask the devil often wears," the preacher replied, his voice slick with false piety. "A lone woman is vulnerable. You should send him away, for your own good." There was a threat hidden in his concern, a cold edge that made the hair on her arms stand up. She didn't send Silas away. That evening, when he came for supper, she told him what the preacher had said. Silas just nodded slowly, his face unreadable. He looked around her small home, his eyes lingering on the heavy wooden door, the simple glass windows. He wasn't looking at a home. He was looking at a fortress, a weak one. "The Reverend is right about one thing," Silas said, his voice low. "You are vulnerable." Then he looked directly at her. "But not from me." The next day, the first real twist came. It wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet. Silas was helping her patch a small hole in the adobe wall. As he reached up, his sleeve slid down, and she saw it. A scar on his forearm, a jagged, ugly white line in the shape of a lightning bolt. Her blood ran cold. She dropped the bucket of mud she was holding. It hit the ground with a wet slap. It was the same scar her husband, Liam, had. He'd gotten it as a boy, when a branding iron slipped. She had traced that scar with her fingertips 1,000 times. There was no mistaking it. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silas froze. He slowly pulled his sleeve down, hiding the mark. His face was a mask of stone. "Ranching accident," he said, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. A lie. It was a bald-faced lie, and she knew it. Liam was an only child. He had no brothers. Who was this man? Was he a ghost? A trick? Was her grief finally making her see things? For the first time since he'd arrived, she was truly, deeply afraid of him. He wasn't a kind stranger. He was an impossibility. A man with her dead husband's scar. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the cold hearth, a heavy iron skillet in her lap, watching the door. Every creak of the house made her jump. He hadn't come for supper. It was the first night he'd missed since the storm. Was he gone for good? Or was he out there in the dark, watching her? The answer came just before dawn. Not from Silas, but from him. The other one. The cruel cowboy. His name was Jed. He didn't bother knocking this time. He kicked the door clean off its leather hinges. It crashed to the floor, and he stood there, silhouetted against the pale morning light, a long-barreled revolver in his hand. "Mornin', widow," he sneered. "We missed our little chat." He wasn't alone. 2 other rough-looking men stood behind him. They weren't here for beans. "What do you want?" Ilara asked, her voice shaking but her grip tight on the skillet. "My pa, he lost something," Jed said, stepping inside. His eyes scanned the small room, hungry and cruel. "Something your thievin' husband took before he died. A ledger, full of numbers. We think he might have left it with you." Her husband, a thief. Liam was the most honest man she'd ever known. It was a lie. "There's no ledger here," she said. Jed just smiled. It was a predator's smile. "We'll see about that." He gestured to his men. "Tear the place apart." They started breaking things. They overturned her table, smashed her pottery, ripped the simple blanket off her bed. Alara stood frozen, helpless. This was it. This was the end. And then a voice came from the doorway, a calm, cold voice that cut through the chaos. "I think you boys should leave." It was Silas. He was standing where the door used to be, the morning sun at his back. He looked different. The quiet patience was gone. In its place was something hard and incredibly dangerous. He held a pistol in his hand, and he held it with a familiarity that spoke of 1,000 violent hours. Jed spun around, his own gun coming up. "Well, look what we have here. The widow's pet. You made a big mistake, friend." "You're the one who made the mistake," Silas said, his voice dropping even lower. "You came back." What happened next was a blur. Jed fired first. The gunshot was deafening in the small room. But Silas moved like smoke. He wasn't where he had been a second ago. A flash of fire erupted from his own gun, and one of Jed's men grunted and fell, clutching his shoulder. Silas fired again, the shot precise, knocking the gun from the other man's hand. It was over in 2 seconds. The 2 men were down, and Jed was standing there, his face pale with shock and fury, his gun still smoking. He was staring at Silas not as a rival, but as a man staring at a legend he'd only heard stories about. "You," Jed stammered. "You're him. You're the ghost of the Rio Grande." Silas didn't answer. He just took a step forward, his pistol aimed dead center at Jed's chest. "Get out, and tell your father, Bartholomew, that his time is up." The name hit Alara like a physical blow. Bartholomew Hayes, the richest, most powerful rancher in the territory, the man who owned the town, the saloon, the preacher, everything. He was a smiling tyrant, a man everyone feared, and apparently Jed was his son. Jed backed away slowly, dragging his wounded men with him. He shot one last look at Alara, a look of pure hatred. Then they were gone. The silence that fell was heavier than before. The room was destroyed. Her safe, quiet world was shattered. She looked at Silas, the smoking gun still in his hand, the cold, deadly focus in his eyes. The kind stranger was gone. In his place was a killer, a ghost. "Who are you?" she asked, the words catching in her throat. "What was that scar?" Silas finally looked at her. The hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. He holstered his pistol. "My name is Silas, and that scar, I got it standing right next to the man who gave it to your husband." He took a deep breath. "Liam wasn't my brother, he was my partner." Partner, Liam had been a simple rancher, a horse trader. Partner in what? "We were federal marshals," Silas said, and the whole world tilted on its axis. "We were undercover, investigating Bartholomew Hayes. We believed he was using his ranching empire as a front for a massive gun-running operation, selling repeater rifles to bandits across the border. The skirmish that killed Liam. It wasn't a skirmish, it was an ambush, set up by Hayes. They killed him because he had the proof." He pointed to the wreckage of her home. "The ledger Jed was talking about. It has every name, every date, every shipment. It's the evidence that will bring Hayes and his entire operation down. Liam told me in his last letter that if anything happened to him, he'd hidden it somewhere his wife would protect, even if she didn't know she was protecting it." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate hope. "He hid it here, Alara, in this house, and we have to find it before Hayes sends more than just his son." So her husband wasn't just a victim of random violence. He was a hero, a lawman murdered for doing his job. And her quiet life hadn't been quiet at all. It had been the calm in the eye of a hurricane. For 3 years, she'd been sleeping on top of a secret that could get her killed, a secret that had already cost her husband his life. The man in front of her wasn't a kind stranger who'd stumbled into her life. He was a part of a past she never even knew existed, a past that was now coming to tear her future apart. They weren't just 2 lonely people finding comfort. They were soldiers in a war that had just followed them home, and the first battle had just been fought in her kitchen. The shock was a physical thing, a cold wave that washed through her, leaving her trembling. Her husband, a federal marshal. Her home, a hiding place for evidence that could topple a king. The quiet man mending her fence, a legendary gunfighter known as the Ghost of the Rio Grande. It was too much. The world she knew had been a lie, a carefully constructed stage, and the curtain had just been ripped away. A ledger, she repeated, her voice a hollow echo in the ruined room. He never said anything. He was protecting you, Silas said, his voice gentle now, trying to pull her back from the edge. If you didn't know, you couldn't tell them anything. It was the only way he could keep you safe. Safe. She looked at her shattered pottery, the door ripped from its hinges. She didn't feel safe. Where would he hide something like that? It would have to be someplace no one would ever think to look, Silas mused, his eyes scanning the room with a new intensity. Someplace personal, someplace connected to you. They began to search. It felt strange, sacrilegious, to be tearing apart the home she and Liam had built. Silas was methodical, respectful. He checked the loose floorboards, the spaces behind the shelves, the stuffing of her simple mattress. Nothing. Ilara's mind raced, trying to think like her husband. Liam had been a quiet man, but clever. He thought in patterns. He loved puzzles. She walked over to the small bookshelf. It held only a few precious books, a Bible, a book of poems, and her mother's old cookbook. She ran her fingers over the cracked leather spine of the cookbook. It was filled with her mother's spidery handwriting, recipes for stews and breads and preserves, but tucked between the pages were notes in Liam's hand. He'd always been interested in her cooking, adding his own thoughts on seasoning or cooking times. He used to write in here, she said, her voice distant. She started flipping through the pages. A recipe for cornbread had a note, 3 parts flour to 1 part meal. A recipe for bean soup had another, 7 cups water, simmer for 2 hours. It seemed like nonsense. Let me see, Silas said. He took the book and stared at the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked at the notes, then looked around the room. His eyes landed on the hearth, the simple stone fireplace where she cooked every meal, the heart of her home. 3 parts flour, 1 part meal, he muttered. He walked over to the hearth and began counting the stones. 3 stones across the top, 1 large stone for the mantel. He looked back at the book. 7 cups water. 2 hours. He knelt down and counted the stones on the left side, 7, then the right side, 2. His breath caught. It's a cipher, he whispered in awe. He's not writing recipes. He's giving us coordinates. 3 across, 1 down, 7 left, 2 right. His eyes followed the imaginary lines. They all converged on a single dark, soot-stained stone on the back wall of the fireplace, a stone that looked just like all the others. Silas pulled a knife from his belt and carefully began to pry at the edges. The mortar was loose. It had been chipped away and then replaced with simple mud to look old. The stone came free. Behind it was a dark, hollow space, and inside that space was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. Silas reached in and pulled it out. His hands that had just wielded a gun with deadly speed, were now trembling slightly as he unwrapped the oilskin. Inside was a thin, leather-bound ledger. He opened it. The pages were filled with Liam's neat, precise handwriting. Names, dates, locations, figures. It was all there. The proof. He did it, Silas whispered. The brave son of a gun, he did it. Ilara stared at the book. That little ledger was the reason her husband was dead. It was the reason her home was in ruins. It was the reason this deadly, silent man was now standing in her kitchen. Liam had hidden his secret in the one place he knew was sacred to her. Her fire. The source of all the meals she gave away, the warmth she offered to a cold world. He had trusted her to protect it without her even knowing. Her kindness had been his shield. The weight of it all was crushing. She felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, at Liam for leaving her with this burden. It was followed by a wave of profound love and pride. He had been more than just a quiet husband. He had been a warrior fighting a secret war. Just as the reality of their discovery began to sink in, a sound from outside shattered the moment. A single, loud gunshot that echoed across the desert. It wasn't aimed at them. It was a signal. Silas was at the window in an instant, peering out through a crack in the shutter. His body went rigid. "We're out of time," he said, his voice grim. "It's not just Jed this time. He's brought the whole town." Ilara looked out the other window. He was right. Men were gathering at the edge of her property. Ranch hands from the Hayes estate, but also townsfolk. Men she recognized. The blacksmith, the store owner. Even the preacher, Reverend Miller, was there, a rifle in his hands, his face twisted into a mask of righteous fury. They had been whipped into a frenzy, convinced that she was harboring a dangerous killer and stolen property. Bartholomew Hayes didn't just own their businesses. He owned their souls. They were surrounded. The little adobe house, her sanctuary, was now a trap. "They'll burn us out," Ilara said, her voice flat with despair. "No," Silas said, turning from the window. The ghost was back in his eyes, cold and calculating. "They're going to try." He checked the loads in his pistol, then looked at the rifle he'd taken from one of Jed's men. "There's a rifle. Do you know how to use it?" She thought of Liam teaching her, years ago. For hunting, he'd said. Her hands had been clumsy, the kick of the rifle bruising her shoulder. But she remembered. She nodded. "I do." "Good," Silas said. "Stay away from the windows. Don't fire unless you have a clear shot. We just need to hold them off." "Hold them off until what?" she asked. "No one is coming to help us." A flicker of something, regret, maybe, crossed his face. "Before I came here, I sent a wire to the marshal's office in Prescott. They're sending a posse, but it's a 2-day ride, at least." 2 days. They had to survive for 2 days, alone, against a small army led by the most powerful man in the territory. The odds were impossible. It was a death sentence. The first shot from outside splintered the wooden shutter next to Ilara's head. The siege had begun. They were trapped, the two of them, in a tiny mud-brick house with nothing but a rifle, a pistol, and a book full of secrets. And outside, the sun was beginning to climb, promising a long, hot, bloody day. The fire in her hearth was out, but a new kind of fire was burning in her heart. The fire of a cornered animal. The fire of a widow with nothing left to lose. The world shrank to the size of her small house. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Outside, Jed was yelling, "Give us the lawman, widow! Give us the ledger, and Hayes will let you walk away." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Hayes couldn't afford any witnesses. "Stay down!" Silas ordered, pulling her away from the window as another bullet slammed into the adobe wall, sending a shower of dirt into the room. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion, a predator in his element. He was no longer the quiet stranger. He was a force of nature. He fired 2 shots through the window, not at anyone in particular, but at the places where the gunfire was coming from. The shouts outside turned to angry curses. Ilara crawled to the other side of the room, the rifle heavy and awkward in her hands. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This couldn't be happening. She was a cook, a giver of soup. She wasn't a soldier. But the rifle felt solid in her hands. A piece of Liam. She rested the barrel on the edge of the windowsill, peering through a small crack. She saw them, dozens of them, using wagons and rocks for cover. They were advancing slowly, methodically. And directing them, standing behind a water trough, was Reverend Miller. He was pointing, gesturing, a holy man directing a lynch mob. The hypocrisy of it stole her breath. "The preacher," she said, her voice low. "He's leading them." "He's on Hayes's payroll," Silas grunted, reloading his pistol with swift, practiced movements. "Probably gets a bonus for every soul he damns." A bullet ricocheted off the cast-iron pot hanging by the hearth, the one she'd been stirring beans in just yesterday morning. The sound rang through the house like a death knell. That pot had fed this town, and now the town was trying to kill her. Something inside her snapped. The fear didn't vanish, but it was suddenly joined by a cold, hard rage. She lined up her shot. She saw one of Hayes's men, a big man with a red bandana, break from cover and run towards the house. She remembered Liam's voice in her ear. "Breathe out slow, Elara. Squeeze, don't pull." She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the noise a deafening roar. The man in the red bandana screamed and fell, clutching his leg. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't running anymore. There was a stunned silence from outside. Then Jed's voice, furious. "The squaw has a rifle. Get your heads down." Silas glanced over at her, a flicker of surprise and respect in his eyes. "Good shot." "He taught me," she said, and saying it made Liam feel close, a warm presence in the middle of the cold violence. They settled into a grim rhythm. The attackers would fire a volley, trying to pin them down, and then one or two would try to advance. Elara and Silas would fire back, their shots carefully aimed, forcing them back into cover. They were outnumbered 20-1, but the thick adobe walls of the small house provided excellent protection. It was a stalemate. For now. But they couldn't stay in a stalemate forever. Their ammunition was limited, their water was limited, and their time was running out. As the sun reached its peak, the heat inside the house became suffocating. The shooting slowed. Jed was changing tactics. "They're going for the well," Silas said, his voice tight. Elara saw them. 2 men were crawling towards the well in her yard, the only source of water besides the river a mile away. If they took the well, they could wait them out forever. "I can't get a clear shot," she said, frustration rising in her throat. "Neither can I," Silas admitted. The angle was wrong. Elara looked around the ruined room, her eyes darting everywhere, searching for a solution. Her gaze fell on her spice rack, miraculously still intact on the wall. Tins of salt, bags of herbs, and a small, heavy bag of dried chili peppers, the hottest kind, the ones she used sparingly to give her stew a kick. An idea sparked, born of desperation and a lifetime spent in a kitchen. "I have a plan," she said. "It's crazy, but it might work. Keep them busy." Silas didn't question her. He just nodded and began firing steadily from his window, drawing their attention. Elara grabbed the bag of chili peppers. She crept to the hearth. A few embers were still glowing deep within the ashes. She carefully placed a handful of the dried peppers onto the embers. Then she grabbed the small bellows she used to stoke the fire and pointed it up the chimney. She began to pump. At first, nothing happened. Then a thin, acrid smoke began to drift up the chimney. It wasn't normal smoke. It was weaponized smoke, thick with the oily, vaporized capsaicin of a dozen ghost peppers. The wind was low and the smoke hung in the air, a pale, almost invisible cloud that drifted slowly, inevitably, towards the men hiding near the well. It took about 30 seconds. A cough, then another, then a strangled scream. The 2 men at the well suddenly jumped up, their hands clawing at their eyes, their faces red and contorted in agony. They were screaming, choking, completely blinded and disoriented by the chemical assault. They stumbled around blindly, easy targets. "Don't kill them," Elara said quickly. Silas understood. He fired 2 quick shots, not at their chests, but at their feet. The men howled and fell, their legs useless. The well was secure. From across the yard, Jed roared in frustration. They had been outsmarted, not by a gunslinger's trick, but by a cook's spice rack. The attack stalled. They had won a small victory, but the sun was starting to set, and the darkness would bring new dangers. Night would give the attackers the cover they needed to creep up to the house undetected. "We won't survive the night," Alara stated, the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "We have to," Silas said. He was staring at her, a strange look on his face. "All my life I've fought with this," he said, tapping his pistol. "I never thought the deadliest weapon in this house would be in your kitchen." It wasn't a compliment, it was a revelation. For years she had let the town define her, the quiet widow who cooks, the woman who wasn't much good for anything else. They thought her kindness, her domesticity, was a weakness. They were wrong. It was her strength. Her knowledge wasn't of guns and tactics, but of fire and herbs, of heat and pressure. And in this fight for her life, that knowledge was just as deadly. But as darkness fell, a new sound began. A rhythmic, heavy thudding from the direction of the town. Thump, thump, thump. "What is that?" Alara whispered. Silas listened, his face grim. "It's a battering ram," he said. "They're going to come through the wall. They couldn't shoot a log. They couldn't reason with it. They were going to be buried alive in the ruins of her home." The temporary victory of the chili smoke turned to ash in her mouth. The night was here, and it had brought its own monsters. The thudding grew louder, closer. It was the sound of impending doom, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat counting down the last seconds of their lives. Thump. A crack appeared in the wall next to the hearth. Thump. Dust and chunks of dried mud fell to the floor. The house groaned around them. "We have to get out of here," Silas said, grabbing her arm. "When they break through, it'll be a distraction. We go out the back window." "And go where?" Alara cried. "They have us surrounded." "To the arroyo," he said, his mind working fast. "It's our only chance. It'll give us some cover to make it to the river." Thump. The hole in the wall was now big enough to see through. She could see the straining faces of the men on the other side, their bodies thrown against a massive log. Jed was behind them, screaming encouragement. This was her home. They were destroying her home. Everything she had, everything Liam had built, was being torn apart. A fierce, protective fury rose up in her, drowning out the fear. "No," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Silas looked at her, confused. "No?" "They are not driving me from my home," she said. She looked at the hearth, at the splintered remains of her kitchen. "I'm going to burn it down first." He stared at her as if she'd gone insane. But then he saw the look in her eyes. It wasn't madness. It was strategy. The cold, clear-eyed logic of a woman pushed too far. "The roof is old," she said quickly, her mind racing. "Dry timbers, thatched with river reeds. It'll go up like a torch. We set it on fire and use the smoke and chaos as cover." It was a desperate, suicidal plan, but it was better than waiting to be crushed to death. "How?" Silas asked. Alara grabbed the small tin of kerosene she kept for her lamp. "This." She began splashing it on the curtains, the wooden table, the bed sheets. Silas, catching on, helped her, moving quickly. The ledger was tucked safely inside his shirt. That was the only thing that mattered. Thump. Crack. The log broke through. A huge, gaping hole appeared in the wall, and the triumphant faces of Jed's men peered through. They saw Alara and Silas, standing there amidst the wreckage. They saw the kerosene tin in her hand. They saw the lit match. Jed's triumphant smile vanished. "What are you doing, you crazy witch?" Alara looked him dead in the eye. "My husband taught me that some things are worth protecting," she said, "and some things are worth burning to the ground." She dropped the match. The world erupted in fire. The kerosene-soaked curtains went up with a roar. flames climbing the walls in an instant. The dry wooden furniture caught immediately, and a wave of intense, suffocating heat rolled through the small house. Smoke, thick and black, filled the room, blinding everyone. Outside, the men on the battering ram recoiled, yelling in alarm as smoke and flames billowed out of the new hole in the wall. The attack dissolved into chaos. "Now!" Silas yelled, grabbing her hand. He kicked out the back window frame and they scrambled through, coughing and sputtering, their eyes streaming from the smoke. They landed hard on the ground outside. For a moment, they were exposed. But the fire was the perfect distraction. The entire house was now an inferno, a funeral pyre that lit up the night sky. Everyone was staring at the fire, mesmerized by the destruction. No one was looking at the back of the house. They ran. They scrambled down the short bank into the dry creek bed of the arroyo, the rough stones cutting at their hands. They kept low, using the darkness and the contours of the land for cover. Behind them, the sounds of shouting were confused, disorganized. It would take them minutes to realize their prey had escaped. Minutes they desperately needed. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. The roaring of the fire faded, replaced by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the chirping of crickets. They finally collapsed behind a rocky outcrop, miles from the burning remains of her life. Ilara looked back. A pillar of smoke and orange light rose into the dark sky, a gravestone marking where her home used to be. She had lost everything. Her house, her belongings, the last physical traces of her life with Liam. She had nothing left. "I'm sorry, Ilara," Silas said, his voice raw. She shook her head. She wasn't crying. There were no tears left. "Don't be," she whispered. "A house is just wood and mud. They didn't get the ledger. They didn't win." She looked at him, the firelight reflecting in his weary eyes. "We didn't win either. We're fugitives." "Not for long," he said. "We just have to make it to Prescott. Once we hand this ledger over, the law will do the rest." But then, a new sound reached them. The one sound they had been dreading, the baying of hounds. Bartholomew Hayes wasn't a man to be outsmarted twice. He hadn't just sent men. He'd sent trackers. And dogs. They couldn't outrun dogs. The arroyo that had been their escape route was now a trap, funneling them right into the open desert where the dogs would run them to ground in minutes. They were caught between the fire and the teeth. The night was far from over. The baying grew closer, a chilling, relentless sound that promised a savage end. Panic began to set in, a cold, creeping dread. They couldn't run forever. "This way," Silas said, grabbing her hand again, his voice urgent. He pulled her along the arroyo, his eyes scanning the rocky walls. He was looking for something, his instincts as a tracker taking over. "We need to find broken ground, something to confuse them." They stumbled through the darkness, their feet slipping on loose rocks. The dogs sounded like they were right behind them now, their howls echoing off the canyon walls. Ilara's hope, which had flared so brightly with the fire, was dwindling to a tiny ember. Then Silas stopped. "Here," he whispered, pointing up. It was a narrow crevice, a fissure in the rock face, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It looked like a dead end. "Where does it go?" she asked, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it's better than staying down here." He pushed her towards the opening and followed right behind her. The crevice was tight, the rock scraping at their clothes and skin. It twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the rock. The sounds of the dogs grew fainter, confused. The narrow passage was scrambling the scent. It had worked. For a moment, they were safe. They emerged into a small, hidden box canyon, a natural amphitheater of stone, open to the starry sky above. It was a perfect hiding place. There was only one way in or out. They were trapped, but they were hidden. They collapsed onto the sandy floor, utterly spent. For a long time, they just lay there, listening to the sounds of the hunt passing them by. The barking faded into the distance. The shouts of the men disappeared. Silence returned, broken only by the wind whistling over the rocks. "We lost them," Ilara whispered, the relief so profound it felt like a physical weight being lifted. "For now," Silas cautioned. "They'll search again at sunrise. We need to rest." He built a small, smokeless fire using dry brush, shielding it with rocks. The tiny flame pushed back the oppressive darkness, and its warmth was a comfort. In the flickering light, the exhaustion of the last few days was starkly visible on both their faces. They were bruised, cut, and covered in soot. "I never thanked you," Ilara said softly, looking at the fire, "for coming back, for telling me the truth." "I made a promise to Liam," Silas said, his gaze distant. "I told him I'd look after you if the worst happened. I was too late to save him. I wasn't going to be too late for you." He looked at her, his eyes holding a deep, painful honesty. "The scar. Liam and I were captured by bandits a few years back, working a different case. They marked us before we escaped. I saw the same mark on him. That's how I knew who he was when I found his body after the ambush." The story filled in another piece of the puzzle, another secret her husband had carried. He had lived a whole other life she knew nothing about, a life of danger and bravery. "He loved you more than anything, Ilara," Silas continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Every letter he wrote back to the marshal's office, he talked about you, about getting back to his quiet life with you. He was doing all of it, the danger, the lies, so that you could live in peace." Tears finally came to her eyes. Not of grief, but of understanding. She wasn't mourning a simple rancher anymore. She was mourning a hero she had never truly known. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. The shared danger had forged a powerful bond between them, a trust that went deeper than words. She saw him not just as a gunslinger, but as a man of honor, bound by a promise to a fallen friend. And he saw her not as a helpless widow, but as a resilient, resourceful fighter who had set her own life ablaze to protect her husband's legacy. As the sky began to lighten in the east, the fragile peace was broken. A single pebble skittered down the rock face from the entrance of the canyon. Silas was on his feet in an instant, pistol drawn, motioning for her to get back. They weren't alone. Someone had found them. But how? The dogs had gone. A figure appeared at the narrow entrance, silhouetted against the dawn sky. It wasn't Jed. It wasn't the preacher. It was old Samuel, the quiet, arthritic ranch hand she had fed for years. He was holding a rifle, and his face was grim. "Samuel?" Ilara said, stepping forward in disbelief. Had he betrayed them? "Get back, Ilara," Silas warned, his gun still aimed at the old man. "I ain't here to hurt you, son," Samuel said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I followed the smoke, figured you'd need a hand." He looked at Ilara, his old eyes surprisingly sharp. "Liam, he asked me to keep an eye on you. Said if things ever went south, I was to help. He never told me what he was involved in, just that it was dangerous." Another secret keeper. Another person in her life who was more than they seemed. The town she thought was so simple was a web of lies and loyalties she had never seen. "They're regrouping back at the Hayes Ranch," Samuel continued. "Bartholomew is furious. He's sending out riders to every pass, every trail. You'll never make it to Prescott on foot." He paused, then gave them a sly, toothless grin. "But they ain't looking for an old man on a supply wagon." It was a risky plan, but it was their only one. Samuel had a wagon hidden nearby. He would hide them under a pile of blankets and animal hides and try to bluff his way through the roadblocks Hayes had set up. They made their way to the wagon just as the sun was rising. Ilara and Silas squeezed into a cramped space under a pile of foul-smelling buffalo hides. The journey was agonizing, Every bump in the road was a jolt of fear. Every shout from a distant rider made her heart stop. They reached the first roadblock. She could hear Jed's voice, loud and angry, questioning Samuel. "What are you doing out here, old man?" "Just a supply run," Samuel grumbled, his voice perfectly embodying a cranky old rancher. "Town's out of salt pork." "Seen anyone on this road? A man and an Apache woman?" "Ain't seen nothing but rocks and lizards," Samuel spat. "Now get out of my way. These hides ain't getting any fresher." There was a long, tense pause. Alara held her breath, her hand gripping Silas's arm so tightly her knuckles were white. Then she heard Jed say, "Fine, go on. But if you're lying to me, I'll see you hang." The wagon lurched forward. They had made it through. They traveled for the rest of the day, passing through 2 more checkpoints. Samuel's performance was flawless. By nightfall, they were clear of Hayes's territory. They were safe. The old ranch hand had saved them. He dropped them at a small, hidden way station, where a friend of his gave them fresh horses. "This is as far as I go," Samuel said, his duty done. "You give 'em hell for Liam." Alara hugged the old man, her heart overflowing with gratitude. "Thank you, Samuel, for everything." He just nodded, tipped his hat, and turned his wagon back towards the home she could never return to. As she and Silas rode off into the night, towards Prescott and the justice they hoped to find there, she felt a profound sense of change. She wasn't the same woman who had stirred beans by a fire. That woman was gone, burned away with her house. The woman who rode next to the ghost of the Rio Grande was someone new, someone forged in fire and loss, someone who had learned that the greatest strengths can be hidden in the quietest of hearts. The ride to Prescott was tense and silent. They pushed the horses hard, constantly looking over their shoulders, but no one followed. 2 days later, they arrived, dusty and exhausted, and rode straight to the United States Marshal's office. The marshal in charge, a stern man named Davies, listened to their story with a stony expression. He knew of Silas, the ghost, by reputation. He had also been the one to sign off on Liam's undercover assignment. He took the ledger and his face grew grim as he turned the pages. "This is comprehensive," Davies said, a low whistle escaping his lips. "Hayes has been a thorn in our side for years, but we never had anything solid. This changes everything." He looked up at them, his eyes filled with a new respect. "You've done well, both of you. We'll take it from here." A federal posse was organized immediately. Davies himself would lead it. "You two have been through enough," he said. "Stay here, rest. Justice is coming for Bartholomew Hayes." But Silas shook his head. "With all due respect, Marshal, this is our fight. Liam was my partner. Alara, they burned down her home. We're seeing this through to the end." Marshal Davies looked from Silas's determined face to Alara's. He saw the same steel in her eyes. He nodded slowly. "All right, saddle up." They rode back not as fugitives, but as an army. A force of 25 federal marshals, heavily armed and riding under the banner of the law. As they neared the town, the tables had completely turned. It was no longer 2 people against a town. It was the United States government against a corrupt rancher and his hired thugs. They arrived at the Hayes Ranch at dawn. It was a sprawling, arrogant fortress of a place. But it was no match for the marshals. The fight was short and brutal. Hayes's men, so brave when they were tormenting a lone woman, lost their nerve when faced with trained lawmen. Many surrendered immediately. The final confrontation happened in the main house. Bartholomew Hayes, a big, imposing man with a silver mustache and cold, dead eyes, was waiting for them, a shotgun in his hands. Jed and Reverend Miller were with him, cornered and desperate. "You have no authority here," Hayes bellowed as the marshals stormed in. "This ledger says otherwise," Marshal Davies said, holding up the book. "Bartholomew Hayes, you're under arrest for gun running, conspiracy, and the murder of Federal Marshal Liam Standing Bear." Hayes's face went pale. He had been exposed. With a roar of fury, he raised the shotgun, but Silas was faster. A single shot from his pistol sent the shotgun clattering to the floor. In the same motion, Ilara, who had picked up a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, swung it with all her might, striking the rifle from the preacher's hands. Jed was the last one. He looked at Ilara, his face a mask of hate, and lunged for her. But she didn't flinch. She stood her ground, and before he could reach her, Silas stepped between them, his pistol pressed under Jed's chin. "It's over," Silas said, his voice cold as ice. It was. The reign of Bartholomew Hayes was finished. He, his son, the preacher, and all of their men were taken into custody. As they were led away in chains, the townsfolk who had once thrown their lot in with Hayes now stood by silently, their faces a mixture of fear and shame. They looked at Ilara, standing there next to the marshals, and they didn't see the quiet, useless widow anymore. They saw the woman who had brought down a king. In the aftermath, Marshal Davies made Ilara an offer. "The government will compensate you for your lost property, and for your husband's service. You can go anywhere you want. Start a new life." She thought about it. She could leave this place of ghosts and painful memories behind forever. But as she looked at the dusty street, at the faces of the people, she realized something. This was her home. It was broken and scarred, but it was hers. And it needed healing, just like she did. "I'm staying," she said. Silas, who had been standing quietly by his horse, looked at her. He didn't say anything, but a slow smile spread across his face. Life in the town changed. With Hayes gone, the grip of fear was broken. People started to talk to Ilara again. They came to her, one by one, their apologies clumsy and heartfelt. Old Samuel became a town elder, respected for his quiet courage. The house was rebuilt, not by Ilara alone, but by the entire community, a barn-raising of apology and reconciliation. It was bigger and stronger than the old one, but in the center of the main room, at Ilara's insistence, they built a new hearth, using the same stones from the old fireplace, salvaged from the ashes. Silas stayed. He turned in his badge. His war was over. His promise to Liam had been fulfilled. He found a different kind of peace, not at the end of a trail, but in the quiet moments spent with Ilara, sharing a meal by the fire. The silence between them was no longer about loneliness or secrets. It was a language of its own, full of comfort and understanding. One evening, months later, they sat at her table, the smell of fresh bread filling the air. The fire in the hearth burned brightly, casting a warm, golden glow on their faces. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full. She had learned the truth of what she had told the night sky so long ago. She had kept her fire lit, and someone who needed its warmth had not only come, but had stayed. The night had whispered back, and its name was Silas. Her kindness hadn't been a weakness. It was a beacon, and her silence wasn't emptiness. It was a quiet strength that had, in the end, proven louder than any gun. The spark that had leaped into the darkness had not vanished. It had simply waited for the dawn. If you enjoyed this story of hidden strength and unexpected justice, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales that prove the quietest people often have the most powerful stories to tell.